Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan Malott. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia University here in Jajage and co-chair of the annual Graduate Interdisciplinary Conference, otherwise known as AGIC. While we're waiting for more people to enter, I just want to first thank each of you for joining us today, for inviting us into your home or office or wherever you may be around the world for what we hope to be a very important discussion. Though at this point, I'm sure we're all overly familiar with Zoom, I'm just going to go over a few notes concerning accessibility and the format itself before continuing. This presentation will be conducted in English and includes a PowerPoint with photographs and scans. Yes. Automated closed captions are available and can be enabled by pressing the live transcript button on the bottom menu. These transcriptions are AI generated with about 80% accuracy in English. While the PowerPoint is being presented, the panelists' cameras will automatically shift to the right side of your screen. All attendees have the option of toggling the size of the panelist and presentation by pressing and holding the vertical board located between the gallery and shared screen. Drag your mouse either left or right to adjust the size to your liking. All microphones will be disabled for the presentation's duration, as will the public chat box. If you are experiencing any issues, please private message the co-host Tech Help, and we will do our best to help you out. The presentation is approximately 40 minutes in duration and will conclude with a Q&A, which will go until approximately 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. At this point, participants will have the option to either type in questions in the chat box or request to unmute themselves by pressing the raise hand button under the reactions tab on the bottom menu. We kindly ask that all questions be reserved until the Q&A. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to Concordia's Institutional History in an Era of Truth and Reconciliation, a presentation prepared by Colby Gaudet and organized as the inaugural lecture for the 27th Annual Graduate Interdisciplinary Conference's Religion and Decoloniality event and workshop series. In wake of recent events which illuminated the centrality of various religious societies in Canada's residential schools, as well as global systems of Indigenous subjugation, we as scholars of religion are urgently called to consider: how is the study of religion positioned within matrices of colonial domination, both historically and contemporarily? Conversely, in what ways can religion offer a generative perspective from which decolonial disruptions, thoughts, and practices might emerge? The Religion and Decoloniality series seeks to explore these questions as means of developing decolonial options from which future projects, ideas, and languages can emerge, to think with rather than about decoloniality as a means of constructing otherwise modes of religious studies scholarship, and to produce a generative and, importantly, challenging site of critical reflection for participants both within and outside the field of religious studies. We want to emphasize that such a commitment toward decolonization cannot easily be quantified, nor are we suggesting that after this series is over that we will be fully decolonized. Inspired by the words of Catherine Walsh and Walter Mignolo, we recognize that decoloniality is not a static condition, an individual attribute, or a lineal point of arrival or enlightenment. Instead, decoloniality seeks to make visible, open up, and advance radically distinct perspectives and positionalities that displace Western rationality as the only framework and possibility of existence, analysis, and thought. It is thus our hope that the series will shine light on that which has been hidden, to clarify what has been actively obscured from view, and to highlight and at least partially contribute to ongoing and dynamic conversations, actions, and demand, both at Concordia, locally, nationally, and around the globe. We invite participants to check out our website and social media accounts for updates concerning upcoming events, which will be running into the winter 2022 semester and hopefully beyond. This event has been generously sponsored by the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia, and we are pleased to be able to have this event open to the public. In lieu of a ticket, we invite attendees to consider making a donation to the First Peoples Justice Center of Montreal. At this present moment, where various material conditions and political shifts have exacerbated issues which already disproportionately affect and criminalize urban Indigenous communities, including inordinate rates of incarceration, the work being conducted by the center is urgent. A link to their donation page, which accepts amounts as low as $3, can be found in the chat box now. The same link can also be found on our website under the event description. We thank you all in advance for supporting this important work during such a critical period. It is my pleasure to now introduce our presenter for this afternoon. Colby Gaudet is an interdisciplinary researcher in the fields of religion, colonialism, decoloniality, and the histories of Indigenous settler relations. Currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia, they hold a master's degree in Indigenous and Interreligious Studies from the Vancouver School of Theology, and undergraduate degrees in creative writing from Concordia and English literature from Dalhousie. Colby's doctoral research investigates missionary archives and reflects critically on the function of colonial religion in Indigenous settler and diasporic communities in early Eastern Canada. The working title of their dissertation is Sacramental Communities, Atlantic World Catholics and Social Formation in British Nova Scotia. Colby's research is also, in a sense, autobiographical, as they are descended from many of the historical contexts they study, including the settler communities that colonized Mi'kma'ki, otherwise known as Nova Scotia or Acadia, during the 17th and 18th centuries. I would like to thank you all once again for joining us today. At this time, I'll hand over the microphone to Colby to begin their presentation.
Thank you, Jordan, for that introduction. And I'd like to also thank AGIC for inviting me to share this research today. I'm just going to pull up the PowerPoint. Can I just get like a visual confirmation that you can see? Yeah, great. So thank you everyone else who's joined the session today. I thank you, I'm appreciative of your interest and your presence. So as Jordan said, I'll take us through a slide presentation and leave time at the end for important questions and discussion. As one of my prime motivations in presenting this information is to get the Concordia community thinking and talking about this history in a deeper way. I'll make available my email at the close. So any of the information on the slide, some of which I may pass over quite quickly, I'll be more than happy to provide should you wish. You can fire me an email. I also want to offer a content disclosure that there will be some images of Indigenous students at residential schools, as well as a description of graves at one of the schools. I'll try to make a verbal note when these slides are coming up, but please do practice self-care and use resources as necessary. And note the 24-hour residential school survivor support line on the screen. This is especially important, as Jordan noted, as just yesterday, more information was released about unmarked graves by the William Lake First Nation in British Columbia. As many of you perhaps know, Concordia University is located on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk Nation. More information about Concordia's land acknowledgement can be found at the website you see on the screen. Now, taking such an acknowledgement seriously, I want to ask, how can we acknowledge not only Concordia's current presence on unceded Indigenous lands, but also its institutional history vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples and colonialism, not just locally, but globally as well? Many of you are also likely familiar with the two names of the Concordia campuses, Loyola and Sir George Williams, rather. And perhaps you've wondered what those names mean, who or what they represent. I hope to answer these questions today and demonstrate that the legacy of these institutions is still present at Concordia every time we speak these names. This is especially important as we look ahead to Concordia's 50th birthday in 2024. So I want to encourage us to critically ask, considering this history that will be presented today, how will we mark this milestone of our university's growth and development? I've divided this material into 3 sections, 2 dedicated to the founding institutions after which our campuses are named: Loyola, which represents the Jesuit tradition, and Sir George Williams, who was the founder of the YMCA. The 3rd institution I'm calling a partner institution are the Grey Nuns of Montreal, whose historical mother house convent the university purchased and now makes up a significant portion of our downtown SGW campus. All 3 of these are Christian institutions. So considering this, Concordia, which might otherwise be considered a modern secular university, actually has its roots in both Roman Catholic and Protestant Christian education. Furthermore, as will become clearer, the project of Christian mission connects all of them to local and global projects of historical colonization. A loosely chronological overview will be provided for each of these. But before going any further, I would like to also state that the following information was produced as part of a research project for Concordia's Indigenous Directions Action Plan. So I'd like to thank the Leadership Council of Indigenous Directions for having invested in me and trusting in me to do this research. And I'll note only a portion of that research is being presented today. Concordia might be considered a relatively new university. It came into being in August of 1974 from a merger of 2 earlier institutions, as I've mentioned, Loyola College and Sir George Williams University. Considering Concordia's emergence in the late 20th century, you might ask, what colonial history? Certainly other Canadian universities, like for instance Dalhousie and McGill, date to the early 19th century, and their colonial pasts have recently been investigated. On balance, Concordia's colonial history isn't so obvious. However, we must take into account our founding and partner institutions. I'll also note that I'm not the first to draw some of these connections. Afua Cooper, who was the lead author of the Dalhousie University report, noted Loyola College's historical connection to some of the history I will discuss today. So I've taken Cooper's lead and pursued it further. I'll begin by providing some context to the period in which Concordia itself came into being. So generally speaking, the late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of international student organizing and protest. Anti-war and civil rights discourse and Black Power activism were frequent on Montreal campuses. These events included McGill's Congress of Black Writers in October of 1968 and the Sir George Williams Affair of February of 1969. Other important Montreal events of this era included Expo 67 and the October Crisis of 1970. So we might say it was a period of political and social unrest, change, and transformation that, among other things, came during the time of quiet revolution and secularization in Quebec. The institutional consolidation of the Quiet Revolution necessitated the merger of Loyola College and Sir George Williams University. In early 1973, the name Concordia was selected following a Name Your University initiative at the 2 schools. Concordia, the name itself, is a classical ideal that dates to Roman times. It's Latin and means harmonious relations or being of one mind. And that's the definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. It is also, however, a reference to the motto of Montreal, Concordia Salus, which means well-being through harmony. This name makes sense considering it was the result of a merger or a blending of 2 institutions that themselves came together during a period of acute political and social change. So another critical question I want to hold up for us today is how then does this ideal of harmony or peaceful relationship hold up when considering our institutional history? I'll begin with the history of Loyola and the Jesuit tradition. So you'll see here the administrative building of Loyola College, which is perhaps recognizable to those of you who've attended or visited the Loyola campus. Loyola College was established in 1896 as the English language extension of the bilingual Jesuit Collège Sainte-Marie, or St. Mary's College, which was established in downtown Montreal in 1848. However, Jesuit history in Canada is much older than that, so I'll backtrack a bit and then catch up to the Montreal colleges of the 1800s. The Society of Jesus, otherwise known as the Jesuits, was established in Paris in 1540 by the Basque Spanish priest and theologian Ignatius of Loyola. Founded during the time of Protestant Reformation in Europe, the Jesuits were an aspect of the Catholic Counter-Reformation that focused on personal spiritual practice. What became known as Ignatian spirituality was a form of Catholic devotionalism centered on introspective meditation and prayer, as outlined in Loyola's renowned treatise, The Spiritual Exercises. The order's global missionary endeavors began with Loyola's first disciple, Francis Xavier, who traveled to India and Japan carrying the Jesuit message. Francis Xavier died off the coast of China in 1552. Spanish Jesuits soon after arrived in the Americas, and they established Jesuit colleges in Peru and Mexico. Not long after that, French Jesuits arrived in New France in the 1620s. By 1635, Paul Lejeune, the superior of the Jesuits in New France, had established a Jesuit college at Quebec, and it would eventually partner with the Séminaire de Québec in the 1660s. During the 1640s, several Jesuits working at missions in the interior of New France, near Georgian Bay, or what is now the area of Midland, Ontario, were killed by Haudenosaunee and Wendat. Among those supposed martyred Jesuits were Jean de Brébeuf and Gabriel Lallemand. These Jesuit victims of early North American colonial wars have since been interpreted by Catholics globally as the North American martyrs and have been widely venerated. The first Jesuit college in Montreal dates to 1692 and was operated by Claude Chauchetière, a Jesuit who taught math and navigation to the members of the French garrison. During the 17th century, the Jesuits in New France were granted numerous large seigneuries or landed estates by the French crown. In addition to their properties and colleges in Montreal and Quebec City, the Jesuits owned numerous estates granted to them by the French crown for the purposes of supporting the order's educational project and mission settlements. These properties were known as the Jesuits' estates. The largest of these estates you can see listed on the screen. I want to stress this dual intention behind the estates. One, to support education, and two, to support the missionizing of Indigenous communities. The Jesuits would have collected rents and revenues from those Europeans settled on their estates. In addition to their tenants, their estates were also worked by various forms of indentured service and enslavement. Quebecois historian Marcel Trudel, writing in the 1960s, paid special attention to the Jesuits and other ecclesiastical bodies in his research on the history of slavery in New France. He later compiled his research into a biographical dictionary, and in it he enumerates the Jesuits in New France owned Indigenous slaves who were captives of frontier wars from the Great Lakes region to the Mississippi and westward. Enslaved Indigenous persons known as Panis and Panis were also owned by other religious orders, including the Grey Nuns, the Hôpitalières de l'Hôtel-Dieu, both in Montreal and Quebec, the Congrégation de Notre-Dame, and the Séminaire de Québec. After the British conquest of Quebec and the global suppression of the Jesuits by the papacy, it was decided that Jesuits' estates in New France would become the property of the British Crown following the death of the last Jesuit in Quebec. In March of 1800, Jean-Joseph Cassot, the last Jesuit of the pre-suppression era, died in Quebec City. So from that time onward, it was a regular subject of public debate in Quebec, what would happen to the Jesuit estates and their revenues. And it was on numerous times during the decades of the early 19th century argued that the estate's revenue should be used to endow a Catholic college in Montreal. These plans, however, did not actualize. It took several more decades until the Jesuits' estate settlement of 1888-89, which eventually ended the public debate about the estates, and monetary settlement was made to the Jesuit order in Quebec, the Quebec bishops, and the new Université Laval. Before that, however, in 1842, a group of 9 European Jesuits arrived in Montreal at the invitation of the city's bishop, Ignace Bourget. Bourget envisioned the Jesuits' return as part of a larger social project of Catholic renewal in post-rebellion Quebec. One of the forecasted projects for the Jesuits in Montreal was to establish a French language Catholic university. So in the fall of 1848, the Collège Sainte-Marie was opened on Bleury, just south of Sainte-Catherine, and French Jesuit Félix Martin was the first rector of the college, serving from 1848 to 1856. From the earliest days in 1848, a significant cohort of the college's students were Irish Catholics. So programs were also offered in English, and it was in 1896 that Loyola College was established as an extension of this English language program. Arthur Jones was one such English Jesuit from St. Mary's, who became the college's first archivist. Jones' career spanned to Loyola College as well. He served as rector, one of the first rectors of Loyola College from 1901 to 1904. These are images of the Collège Sainte-Marie. The college building itself has since been demolished. However, the college chapel, which you can kind of just see behind the building in the photograph, known as the Jesuits, still stands today. When Loyola opened, the plan for the campus you can see there, a leaflet was distributed celebrating the college's classical model, and it read, quote, this tradition has met with success for centuries in the schools of the Society of Jesus in Europe and America. The aim is to develop the moral and mental faculties of the students to make good Christians, men who shall be an ornament to religion and the upholders of Christian society, end quote. Eventually, the Loyola College Chapel was opened in 1933. And I want to draw your attention now to the stained glass window you can see in the front of the chapel. The window itself is a depiction of the Jesuit martyrs who I discussed earlier. As examined by Emma Anderson at the University of Ottawa, the Jesuit martyrs have been constructed as the spiritual founding fathers of Canada. Their work was to convert the supposedly uncivilized Indigenous nations to Christianity, and there has been a long tradition of commemorating these Jesuit martyrs at Loyola College. This tradition, along with the window itself, deserves to be studied further by the Concordia community if we are to make any claims of truth and reconciliation. I want to offer now a content warning before I proceed to the next slide, which presents a historical document that contains racist and ethnocentric language. I've included it in this presentation not in any way to support such language, but rather to demonstrate how recently this type of language was circulating on the Loyola campus, as troubling as it is. I will read from the document, however, I won't read the word in question. However, you will see the text on the screen and you can read along. So this is the dedication of the 1949 Loyola College Review, an issue commemorating the tricentennial of the death of the Jesuit martyrs in Canada. So as you can see, the review was dedicated to the Jesuits in question and reproduced an image of the chapel window itself. It reads, quote, "We dedicate the 1949 Loyola College Review in commemoration of the 300th Canadian martyrs, courageous missionaries, saints among whose spirit of self-sacrifice and of heroism, whose love for God and their fellow man enabled them to endure untold agony and torture, that they might convert the Indians and make Canada the great and God-fearing nation it is. We offer this annual as our humble recognition of their deeds." It then goes on to compare Indigenous peoples to post-war Soviet communists, which was a common trope of that time. So that's the recent legacy of the Jesuits at Loyola College. When the Jesuits returned to Montreal in 1842, some of them were sent to establish missions among the Anishinaabe at Walpole Island on Lake St. Clair, just north of Detroit, and at Manitoulin Island in Georgian Bay. The Indigenous population at Walpole expelled the Jesuits in 1849. The Jesuits at Manitoulin, however, established a mission and day school known as Wigwamacong. In 1879, they began receiving federal funds from the new Canadian government. The Jesuits then opened in 1913 in Spanish River, Ontario, on the mainland this time, a larger federally funded residential school. Spanish, as the school became known, was an updated replacement to the Jesuits' former mission school at Wikwemikong on Manitoulin Island. Wikwemikong had been attended mostly by Ojibwe Anishinaabe from the region around Georgian Bay. Ottawa's Department of Indian Affairs, or the DIA, mandated that the residential school be relocated from the island to the mainland to accomplish two goals. One, to remove the children from the reserve community on Manitoulin, and two, to make the school accessible to Mohawk students from the east who would be transported to the school by train. The Spanish residential school, of which there were separate boys and girls schools, operated until 1958, when the Jesuit-run boys' school closed. The girls' school, operated by the Daughters of the Heart of Mary, closed in 1962. Numerous Jesuits, and I want to stress this, from Loyola College worked at the residential school, including several principals who were former students and teachers at Loyola. These included Victor Gravel, Edward Leo Burns, and William James Kearns. Also, Loyola College rectors, John Milway Fillion and William Hingston, went on to become Jesuit provincial superiors, and among their duties was administrating the Spanish school, among the other Jesuit schools of Ontario. Spanish was the only residential school in Canada operated by the Jesuit order. Basil Johnston was a survivor of this Spanish residential school. He published his experience there in his memoir called Indian School Days in 1988. He described life at Spanish as a sentencing. Their daily routine was strictly regulated, students were often punished by the Jesuits, and there were high levels of student death in the early years of the school. In 1920, a DIA inspector commented in a report saying, quote, "I noticed when passing the cemetery that there appeared to be quite a number of graves. By looking over the fence, I could count over 60 graves. That seemed to be a great many for such a short time as the school has been in existence," end quote. The report came 7 years after the school opened, but also shortly after the 1918 influenza pandemic. This is an image taken from the archives of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, who have a Jesuits of Canada collection of unidentified Jesuits from the Spanish residential school. It's undated, but it must be from the early decades of the 20th century. This is an image of two of those Jesuits along with the male students at Spanish. And you can note in the caption that the Jesuits were known by the Indigenous students and by Indigenous communities largely as black robes. And this was a term Jesuits were known by since the earliest days of colonization, and it was a reference to their habit of dress, a long black cassock, which you can see the two Jesuits at the front wearing. I'll move now to the Grey Nuns, who were established in Montreal in 1737 by Margaret Duville as a Roman Catholic congregation of women religious, or nuns. They were known officially as the Sisters of Charity. Margaret Duville was born in 1701, and she became a young widow. Her husband died at the age of 30. He was a fur trader, and Marguerite inherited some of his business interests that she later developed in the 1730s. In 1747, the Grey Nuns gained control of a defunct hospital in Montreal that had previously been run by a Catholic brotherhood. During the 7 Years' War, the Grey Nuns Hôpital Général, as it became known, was a pivotal establishment in Montreal. It attended to war casualties, epidemics, homelessness, and poverty. In 1871, the Grey Nuns moved and occupied their new, larger mother house, what is now Concordia's Grey Nuns building. The chapel there, which is now a reading room, was completed in 1878. This is an image of Margaret Duville from a biography of her life that was published in 1900. And you can see the habit of dress that garnered the sisters the name of Grey Nuns. It was a black and gray habit, and they were most identifiable by a sort of diaphanous black lace that sort of shielded their face. While Margaret Duville was canonized or made a saint by the Catholic Church in 1990, she was also involved in systems of power and domination of her time that lent her significant local power. As I already noted, early in her life, from her deceased husband, she inherited an indigenous slave upon his death, and she would go on to own several other slaves during her lifetime. Historian William Henry Foster has stated that it was this enslaved indigenous labor, as well as the labor of New England war captives, that enabled the Grey Sisters to build their hospital into the social institution in Montreal that it was in the 1750s and 1760s. You can see here a projected plan for the completed mother house. It was published in 1875. It should be recognizable to some of you. You can see in the background, basically the neighborhood that the SGW campus now occupies. In 1844, 4 Grey Nuns left the Montreal community to travel west to establish a convent at St. Boniface, or what would become Winnipeg. By the late 1850s and into the 1860s, a missionary network was established throughout northwestern Saskatchewan, and these included residential schools at Lac Sainte Anne, Île-à-la-Crosse, Lac-la-Biche, and Fort Providence. The purpose of these missions was to provide residential schooling for Indigenous students, both male and female. The Grey Nuns were responsible for the girls and the young boys, and the Oblates, a male Catholic order, taught the older boys. Grey Sisters were routinely deployed, and I want to stress this, from the Montreal community to provide teaching staff for these missions and residential schools. They quickly expanded further. The school at Fort Chipewyan in what's now northern Alberta was opened in 1874, and also in 1874, the Grey Nuns opened a school at Fort Totten in North Dakota. This is a watercolor image of the Cathedral and Grey Nuns convent at St. Boniface, and that's the Red River that you see in the foreground. So this is the image that you saw at the opening of the presentation. This is a photo of Grey Nuns and children at Fort Chipewyan. It's undated. I want to underline that it was the Grey Nuns building, what Concordia calls the Grey Nuns building, the historical mother house, needs to be understood for its role in dispatching the sisters to the Northwestern missions and residential schools during the period from the 1860s until the 1950s and 60s, so basically a full century. Their records routinely mention the arrival of sisters from the Northwest and the departure from Montreal of fresh sisters for the same destinations. So if we think of the missionary network they created as a nerve system, the Montreal Mother House was the brain of such a system. This is the backside of that same photograph, and it demonstrates this institutional connection, as it not only names the women in question, but it ties them back to the Montreal Mother House where the image itself ended up, as you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner in the archives of the Maison Mère des Sœurs Grises de Montréal. And I find this very small notation very telling and very poignant. By 1884, the federal government of Canada agreed to fund 3 new larger residential schools. These schools were distinct from the earlier mission schools that had been funded by their respective religious denominations. The 1884 schools were opened on the federal model that was promoted by the 1879 Davin Report. Of these 3 new federally funded schools, 1 was Anglican and 2 were Roman Catholic and staffed by Grey Nuns, those being the Capel School in Lebret, Saskatchewan, and the Dunbow School in High River, Alberta, or what would become Alberta in 1905. These schools were much larger and better equipped than previous residential schools operated by missionary societies. Several additional Grey Nun schools were opened during the period between 1896 and 1898, which you can see listed at the bottom of the screen there. Another content disclosure is the next slides contain class photos of residential school students from these schools. These are male students from the Capel Residential School where the Grey Nuns worked in 1907. This is also taken from the archives of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. They have a Grey Nuns collection that I've taken these from. And these are female students with 2 Grey Nuns instructors at the Beauval School in Saskatchewan in 1935. The turn of the 20th century saw a wave of further schools opened in the north, with the Grey Nuns invited again to take up further teaching administrations. And you can see the dates and locations listed there. It was in 1951 that saw the first Inuit woman take vows as a professed Grey Nun. In February of that year, a young woman called Povalirak became known as Sister Pelagie at Chesterfield Inlet in what's now Nunavut. I also want to stress that much further research is needed on Grey Nuns' involvement in these schools and hospitals. The research that I did for this project was really quite cursory, just to get a sense of the development of these schools, where they were located. But not only did they operate schools, they were also often associated with hospitals, which I was able to get a bit of information from. But I think this is an important project for Concordia students to take quite seriously, that much further research can and needs to be done on this subject. Here we can see Indigenous students, Grey Nuns, and Oblates at the Fort Resolution School in the Northwest Territories in 1944-45. So Roman Catholic missionary theology underwent an important change in the 1960s following the Vatican II councils that sought to bring the church into a modern world. And among these changes was an emphasis on intercultural dialogue, ecumenism, and lay ministry. This resulted in the Grey Nuns questioning their presence at residential schools in or near Indigenous communities that increasingly sought to direct the education of their own children. So the late 1960s and early 1970s saw the Grey Nuns withdraw from many of their former residential schools, which then came under provincial or tribal leadership. In 2004, Concordia announced the purchase of the Grey Nuns Mother House. Acquisition began in 2007 and was completed in 2014. Concordia paid $18 million for the building and the property. The Grey Nuns building now houses a student residence, classrooms, and a reading room in the congregation's former chapel. In 2010, the body of Margaret Duville was removed from the building's crypt and transported to a shrine in Varennes outside Montreal, which was Duville's birthplace. So now I'll turn to the third institution, this being the YMCA, or the Young Men's Christian Association. Sir George Williams College had been established in 1926, and its university charter was granted in 1948, as an extension itself of the Montreal YMCA's adult education program, which had been established in 1873. The YMCA was founded in London, England, in 1844 by George Williams, after which our college was named. It was intended to counteract the perceived threats to Christian morality presented by increased urban living, industrialization, and secularization. It focused on urban or city missions, and their activities included Sunday school programs, street preaching, prayer meetings, visits to prisons, orphanages, shelters, and hotels. They also participated in religious tract and Bible distribution. And this is what scholars have recently called Protestant modernity. You can see here an image of Sir George Williams. The YMCA placed an emphasis on bodily practice and athleticism, and it became known as muscular Christianity. This movement was premised on a masculinized public Christian practice in the Victorian era, which in the Victorian era had become, had otherwise come to be perceived as a private feminized religion. Robust athletic male bodies were considered the most effective vehicle for the spread of Protestant modernity across the globe, especially among non-Westerners. YMCAs became very popular in colonies of the British Empire. The first YMCA in North America was, in fact, here in Montreal. It was established in November of 1851 at St. Helens Baptist Church in the Old Port. I'll note that there was also a YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, established in London in 1855 that continued to spread throughout the course of that century as well. Adult education was the central aspect of the YMCA educational program. By 1873, the Montreal YMCA had launched its own building at Victoria Square. And by 1892, it was then replaced by a larger building at Dominion Square and included state-of-the-art facilities, including a reading room, a kitchen, assembly and lecture hall, and a gymnasium. An integrative educational approach was embodied in the Y's threefold model for Christian education of body, mind, and spirit. This educational scheme, launched in 1891, was represented by the YMCA logo, an inverted red triangle representing the integration of body, mind, and spirit. This emblem is still part of Concordia's coat of arms today. I'll also note that the Jesuits' solar insignia is also still part of Concordia's coat of arms. By 1926, the adult education program of the Montreal YMCA was organized at Sir George William College, later becoming Sir George Williams University. The Montreal YMCA launched the first boys' summer camp in Canada in 1894 and developed it further in 1910. It became known as Camp Ganawana, located in the Laurentians just north of Montreal. So to give you some contextual background, summer camps were understood as necessary at this time for childhood development and permitted YMCA boys to get in touch with the nurture of nature. The ideology behind summer camps complemented the goal of the YMCA to provide antidotes to the perceived moral declension triggered by modern living. Sharon Wall, in her study of Ontario summer camps of the early 20th century, concluded that camp culture was symptomatic of anti-modernist movements that sought to counteract the effects of over-civilization. Wall says one of the motivating social changes behind summer camps, quote, was increasing skepticism regarding the impact of urban living. And she goes on, from this perspective, nature seemed to offer everything the city lacked: tranquility, purity, and character building opportunities, end quote. This YMCA camp culture also included playing Indian, an idea developed by cultural studies scholar Philip Deloria. For Deloria, playing Indian at summer camp or in Boy Scouts in the beginning decades of the 20th century offered sons of modern urban and suburban settler families the opportunity to, quote, act out a heuristic encounter with the primitive, end quote, as perceived by settlers as the embodied, to be embodied in a reductive and generic image of the Indigenous person in Indigenous culture. This is an image taken from the YMCA archives, held in the Concordia archives of boys from Camp Ganawana, approximately in the 1960s. Here's another image of campers playing settlers and Indians at Camp Ganawana in the 1930s. And again in the 1960s. This is a co-ed camp, you can see. So to conclude the presentation, I just want to reiterate the critical questions I provided at the introduction. So in light of everything that's just been presented, how does the ideal of Concordia as well-being through harmony hold up when considering our institutional history? Second, how can we acknowledge not only Concordia's current presence on unceded Indigenous lands, but also its institutional history vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples and colonialism, both locally and globally? And this is especially important as we look ahead to Concordia's 50th birthday in 2024. How will we mark this milestone? And what actions should the university take? So I do want to, I guess, open it now to discussion and questions. However, you can see there my email address. So if you have any questions for me that you don't feel comfortable asking today, you can certainly ask me via email. Likewise, if you'd like a copy of this PowerPoint, I'm more than happy to make it available, as I realized some of the images probably would benefit from further scrutiny and consideration. So thank you all very much. I'll stop my screen share and hand it back to Jordan.
Wow. Thank you so much, Colby, for that really enlightening and invigorating presentation. So yes, we'll move on to the Q&A period now. So you can either raise your hand and ask your question verbally, we'll unmute you, or you can use the chat function and we'll read out any questions you have from there. Yes, Jordan, get us started.
Yeah, I'll just thank you, Colby, again for offering us so many things to think about as students and as faculty of Concordia. My question to you is rather, it's quite open, but I'm just wondering, you had mentioned these areas for further research for Concordia, by Concordia students or faculty. And I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of where you located all of this information in the archives and where further directions can be made.
Thanks, Jordan. Certainly, yeah. Doing this research, like I said, what I presented today is perhaps, a quarter of what ultimately made its way into the report that I submitted to Indigenous Directions. Even still, though, in submitting that report, I had the sense that I had just sort of scratched the surface. Mostly because I was doing this research last summer, so sort of during a height of COVID quarantine. So a lot of archives weren't physically open for me to visit and review myself. So I certainly relied on the Concordia Records Management and Archives. They were fantastic in providing me with digital material and referring me to material that they knew already existed. So I'd like to thank the archivists at Concordia, certainly. Then also, the Grey Nuns have their own archive, which I was not able to visit in person. Some of their material is on their website, so I relied extensively on virtual material, online archives. I was actually quite surprised and happy with just what I was able to find online. Likewise, the Jesuits of Canada also have a physical archives here, actually in Montreal, which I also did not visit in person, but was able to glean a lot of early primary sources. A lot of them were published in a lot of the early histories from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Historians would just kind of transcribe primary sources and publish them in these texts. Likewise, I also relied heavily on the DIA archives, the Department of Indian Affairs archives, which are at Library and Archives Canada. A lot of those material were available online as well. Certain chronologies, dates, haven't yet been digitized. So yeah, there's lots for the Concordia community, many further directions that could be taken. The YMCA in particular, I think, merits further consideration. I found less material relating to Indigenous peoples locally, but because the YMCA was a global organization that kind of rode, you might say, on the wave of the British Empire, for anyone interested in, East Asia in particular, and, the role of missionary Christianity there, there's many directions that could be taken. Anyone interested in practices of religion in the body or gender, the YMCA could prove really fruitful. And then, as I noted, these individual residential schools where the Grey Nuns worked, I kind of just did an overview of them, but I have this sense that there's a lot of further research to be done, sort of site specifically, in Northern Saskatchewan, in the Northwest Territories. So that's just like a sort of overview of the archives and my situation working in archives kind of at a distance.
Thank you, Colby. Yes, any other questions? Again, you can use the chat and we can read them out for you, or raise your hand and we will unmute you. But in the meantime, I have a question about the logos, because I know you brought that up a couple of times, Colby, but the incorporation of the logos from these institutions into the Concordia logo. do you think that, like, should we change the Concordia logo? Like, any other information on that? I thought that was really interesting.
Thanks, Isabel. Yeah, I certainly gave that consideration, especially since we're kind of seeing these other universities like McGill, like Ryerson, take these critical looks at their history. Ryerson, I believe it's currently known as X University, has decided to change its name, to leave this name of Egerton Ryerson behind. In terms of Concordia, we're in a unique position where we're not named after a historical individual like Dalhousie or McGill or Ryerson. I found it quite interesting learning more about this ideal of Concordia. Yes, it has this kind of classical and imperial legacy, but I do think there's a lot of room for us as a community, as an intellectual community, to work with that. However, yes, it was this, the symbols associated with these Christian institutes that I became interested in, and their lingering presence on the campus, particularly in our coat of arms. I'm not necessarily advocating that the Concordia coat of arms that those items be removed, but perhaps the Concordia community could decide to incorporate a new element, something representing our presence on Indigenous land, into our coat of arms. But I think this language of symbols is important to think about, especially when they convey these like religious histories. And likewise, I just wanted to underscore the fact that these histories are present, in documents that bear our coat of arms, but also in our campus name. So on a day-to-day basis, we're saying, oh, are you going to the Loyola campus? I just want to make students aware of the history. Who was Loyola? What's the tradition behind that? So there are these everyday, seemingly mundane aspects that I early history. But I do think that is a very stark example. Like, I would compare it to the statue of McGill that they've been talking about, right? It's kind of our equivalent. It's a very visual representation of this history that I just don't think a lot of Concordians know. I would suspect there's other imagery on the Loyola campus. I did a little walking around late this past summer to kind of see. I didn't go into any of the buildings because some buildings, the chapel at the time was like a COVID clinic, so I didn't feel right just kind of wandering in there. But for instance, I know the Grey Nuns building, there are images of, there's like a statue of Margaret Duville herself above one of the entrances. So students coming and going from that residence are daily passing by her. So these are all kind of examples that I think merit further consideration. Likewise, inside the Grey Nuns reading room, their former chapel, the Grey Nuns building we've celebrated it for its Quebec heritage value, right? But at the same time, this is very painful in some senses imagery, right? That not all students are going to understand. I study this old Catholic history, so when I walk in there, I'm like, oh, this is interesting to me because I have this intellectual interest in this stuff, so I can make sense of it that way. But for some students who perhaps are not Christian, perhaps particularly Indigenous students, walking into that space may not feel welcoming or safe in any way, shape, or form. So while we're celebrating its heritage value for its architecture and for these 19th century paintings, I think we need to consider whether or not it's appropriate for them to remain in the reading room of a university in the 20th century. I'm not advocating they be destroyed, but perhaps we need to put them into some kind of collection where students choose to go to view them. So I do think, yeah, further consideration and investigation. Like, those are just some examples that I thought of, but I also think that if we're going to focus on one, I think it's that stained glass window.
you. But I think we'll take a question from Tina, and then we have some in the chat that we'll get to. But Tina, if you want to, I asked to unmute you. I don't know if that's working.
Thank you so much, Colby. Me and technology, not a match made in heaven or anywhere else. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And I tend to forget about the Grey Nuns. I always think about Sir George Williams and Loyola merging together to be Concordia as we know it today. I've got a couple of points. I heard that they did take Duville out of the Grey Nuns building, but there were others that remained interned, which I don't know if it's true or not, and I don't know if it's appropriate that this is a residence and that people might not know on who they're sleeping. I don't know. It might not be important to some people, but it might be for others. I just find it a little weird. I'm into transparency. So yes, I never looked at the stained glass that way. I don't know that I looked at the stained glass, sorry, my bad. Hingston Hall, should that be renamed?
That's a great example. I didn't mention it today, but yes, Hingston Hall, one of the historical residences at Loyola College, is named after that rector I mentioned who, he administrated the residential school. I found records, letters from him giving instructions to the Jesuits there. And as for, yes, the crypt in the Grey Nuns building still exists. I don't know if students, when they elect to move into that building as a residence, if they're told that there's the bodies of nuns buried in that building. Like I said, I know that the body of Margaret Duville was removed, but there are still dozens of interred Grey Nuns in the basement of that building. The logistics of the removal of such bodies, I don't know in terms of like health standards, building standards. I don't know how that would work, but I think it's something that, yes, the university should be perhaps more transparent about. I didn't know about the crypt until, again, I started expressing an interest in the Grey Nuns and pursuing it a bit further. So how the university, discloses this information, I think needs to be thought about more, because it's a bit macabre when you do think about it, that there are these bodies that have been interred in that building for over a century.
Because there's a lot of people who have issues about buying properties beside a graveyard. So I would think that would bring on, similar questions. My other point is the statue that is between the PY and the CC building. It's supposed to be representative of Indigenous, and I've always kind of been on a fence about that because I don't know which way to go. I think there should be something, but I don't know if that should be the something.
I did look into that during the research as well. There's a section in the report that I submitted that does address that. That's a more recent addition to the Loyola campus. It was unveiled in 2005. And yes, the issue with that is that it was commissioned by and designed by non-Indigenous people. I did find evidence that stated that elders from Ganawage were consulted during the design of it, but it was commissioned by a Loyola alumnus and was designed by an American sculptor who is known for his historical realism of figures from the American West. So I just don't see that it was an appropriate kind of avenue for actualizing something like that. I also visited it this summer, and it does, I mean, for me personally, it does give me a strange feeling. I wonder why exactly is this here? There is a small interpretive sign, but it doesn't really speak much about the motivation behind it. It just kind of explains what is being represented. But I also think, Tina, you're right, that that's another aspect of like visual material on the campus that some attention should be paid to.
Wonderful. I think we're going to take a question from the chat and then we'll get to you, Thomas. Also, just a quick note, we had a technical difficulty. So if you did send a direct question to AGIC Concordia, you can resend it in the chat to everyone and we will get it that way because we lost a few. We have a question from Gabrielle saying, did you find anything in your research that pertained specifically to the economic funding of Concordia or the history of its funding?
Not so much. I didn't pursue that angle entirely, particularly with the founding of Concordia in 1974. However, if we think more historically, I noted the settlement of the Jesuits' estates in 1888. That came after over a century of like social dispute in Quebec. I didn't find any direct evidence that funds from that settlement went towards the establishment or the construction of Loyola College. I think it is, however, valuable to think that Loyola College was established, opened, launched just 7 years after that settlement. So here the Jesuits of the province received a significant amount of money. It's escaping me right now how much it was. I believe it was $100,000, which was obviously a lot of money in 1888. But that was the only instance where I saw something financial happening, where like the money is coming from like a questionable like circumstance, because like I said, the Jesuits' estates historically were in existence to support missions to Indigenous people. So here it is, the Jesuits are receiving money to have this all settled and kind of dealt with, and then Loyola College is opened. It's kind of just a coincidence of timing, or perhaps some of those funds did go to Loyola College. But as for Concordia itself in 1974, I didn't pursue that, I guess because I wasn't noticing anything in the research that I was doing.
All right. And Thomas, did you have a question?
Hi there. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I apologize. I had a meeting. I got here a little late, so I apologize if you already covered this. But has there been any research done into some of the neo-colonial funding of Concordia, like people who, donors who are, involved in colonial mining practices in Africa or, elsewhere, who are donating, part of their ill-gotten gains to Concordia?
Thanks, Thomas. That's a good question as well. My scope for this research was like Indigenous peoples locally, but in Canada. So I was kind of keeping myself kind of confined to relationships with Indigenous people in that context. I do think when I mentioned potential further research in terms of the YMCA, I think stuff, sort of what you're gesturing towards, could exist in terms of the YMCA, because they did become this huge global organization, sort of everywhere where the British Empire had, its reach or its settlements. Again, I didn't find any evidence of it, but I wasn't looking for it, because in the context of the YMCA globally, that was well beyond the scope of the research that I was doing. But I do have, a hunch that if that's something that someone is interested in, that should be also pursued, because these YMCA men and women, I mean, they were involved in certainly, all kinds of like mission projects, fundraising, especially in East Asia, in Japan, in China. So that's a potential area for research.
We have another question in the chat from Devin. It says, "Hi Colby, thank you for your fascinating presentation. Based on the entirety of your report, do you have any recommendations for first steps that Concordia might take to address this dark history and its contemporary links to the ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples?"
Thanks, Devin. I did make recommendations as part of my report. I didn't include them in this presentation because they're still being, I guess, processed, you might say, by the powers that be within the university. Personally, as the researcher doing this project, I felt quite confident in doing the research. I do this archival work. I had a base knowledge of these Christian organizations. But when it came to the recommendations, I made what I would call, let's say, preliminary recommendations, which I then passed along to Indigenous directions. So ideally, I feel it would be most appropriate for Indigenous directions and perhaps Indigenous students at Concordia to now have a say, as to what recommendations should be made. I don't entirely feel it's my place to prescribe those recommendations. Like I said, I did make preliminary ones. And I've pointed at certain research directions that I think further work needs to be done. But I do think that in terms of recommendations, Indigenous students at Concordia should be able to, learn or hear this research and have a significant voice in terms of what the university does next.
Great. We have another question from the chat from Ariana, who has left now, but can still do the question, asking, do you have any readings relating to these topics we can recommend to students with specific attention to Montreal and Concordia?
Yes, certainly. I have put together kind of a concise bibliography of both secondary sources and primary sources for the purposes of instructors at Concordia. I've done it mostly with a mind for our department in religions and cultures, but I do think this material should be incorporated into our teaching across our departments as appropriate. So that's something if you're interested in, certainly send me an email and I can send you a list of particularly secondary reading on any of those the Jesuits, Grey Nuns, or YMCA for further information.
Perfect. We can also disseminate information through AGIC as well, if that is helpful for anyone. Another question asking about your reflection on the problematic role of Christian missionizing ideology, its relationship to colonialism, and also to the Quiet Revolution, and the effects of its aftermath that we still see today.
Yes, so Christian mission is a huge part of this. It is what I study. So I do want to emphasize, as I noted, that these three institutions are Christian. Our university history, in that sense, is rooted in these Christian educational paradigms. And I think it's important for us to understand that Christian mission was premised on this very Eurocentric, ethnocentric, and often racist premise that anyone who wasn't Christian, perhaps also a Western European Christian, was uncivilized and only partially human. And it was the project of these organizations to go out into the world and to convert non-Christian peoples to Christianity. So it's this monopoly that Christian missionary orders have historically claimed on truth, on universality, on the human condition, that I think is at the heart of all of this that we need to think about. As for the Quiet Revolution, I think it leads us, particularly in Quebec, to think that Christianity is just gone, that all of this was wiped away in the 1960s, and now we live in this secularized society. But what I'm trying to point to is that there are all kinds of areas that perhaps aren't obvious where these traditions have endured, whether it's in a stained glass window or just in like the educational model. For instance, the YMCA's adult education model was premised on this idea of what in the 19th century was called social uplift, right? That it was an opportunity for working class people who traditionally hadn't been included or able to attend a university, let's say like McGill, to both work, but then also to like uplift themselves by attending lectures that were certainly scholarly, but also struck through with a lot of Christian theology.
Thank you. Also, I think Peter wrote in the chat, noting, I think along the lines of Tina's questions, that there are 276 people buried in the Grey Nuns crypt, mainly Grey Nuns from the 19th century.
Thanks, Dr. Gossage. I figured you would have that statistic. Thanks.
And I don't know if Professor Clark wants to speak to what she wrote in the chat. It looks like a bit of a transcript from an interview.
Yeah, it's in the chat. It's not the transcript. Let me go up to see what is there. Excuse me. Yes, here it is. So what I wrote was, have the Grey Nuns done any reckoning past the actions or withdrawal mentioned in the 60s and 70s that you mentioned? Is there anything, if they put anything in the sanctuary at Varennes to acknowledge these problems? Although I understand the sanctuary is more about Marguerite than the that Duville than the order itself.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. I'm not sure about the sanctuary at Varennes. I did visit the site of the old Hôpital Général down at Place Duville in the old port.
Okay.
And I looked at some of the signage there to see what mention they might make of this history. And along with like our own website for the Grey Nuns building, really a lot of the public, like whether it's like historic site signage, like you'll find down at the old port, or the way our own website is kind of promoting or advertising the Grey Nuns building, it's all very cursory. That, you know, the Grey Nuns also opened hospitals, orphanages, and schools in the Northwest. Not even a mention necessarily of residential schools, just hospitals, schools, and orphanages. They certainly did open hospitals and schools for settler communities as well, but I've yet to see any real focused, considered disclosure of really the depth of their involvement in the residential school system.
We have another question in the chat. We're also at 2:45, so if you have any last questions, start asking them now. But Danielle says, thanks so much for this important research. Do you have any thoughts on the relationship between the ideology of these historical Christian missions and that of the university's ongoing secular education mission?
I mean, that's a really good question. I've been doing, this has inspired me to do a lot of reading about the history of universities in Canada. And yeah, you could say or argue, and some have, that this idea of Christian mission lingered in the Canadian university, particularly the idea of a Protestant theology lingered in the Canadian university much later than, for instance, in the United States. A lot of historians will say that by the Second World War, American universities that perhaps had a Protestant theological origin had completely secularized. I don't know so much about the American state, but here in Canada, scholars say that it kind of lingered well into the 1960s. But you're absolutely right that the university and its idea of educational mission, how separate is that from these Christian origins as well? So I do think on some levels that, you know, it does call for us to think or to interrogate critically even just the idea of what are we doing at the university, kind of just like writ large, especially when we're these newer schools from, like, let's say the 1970s that were formed from previous schools, but we kind of tell ourselves that we're like these new schools that, you know, don't have any of this history. I would point to, you know, Concordia, UBC is another school I'm familiar with. I think that's a really great point, and I could probably talk about it a lot further, but for the sake of time, I'll just thank you for the question and say I think that's really, really insightful and kind of at the heart of what I'm thinking about.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we still have a bit of time for some last minute questions. If anyone wants to put it in the chat or raise their hand, we are available until 3. Dr. Gossage.
Thanks, Isabel. And thank you, Colby, for a terrific presentation. You'd think I'd get your name right by this time. I wondered if you have any thoughts on what it'll take for the Concordia community to start paying a bit more attention. Just a brief anecdote. I was at the Grey Nuns building in, I think it was 2017, when the historic, the people from Heritage Canada came to unveil a plaque with some degree of ceremony, and it struck me as completely tone deaf in 2017 to be, you know, talking about the great achievements of the Grey Nuns with almost no reference to residential schools or their involvement there. So, I mean, I think you could say the same thing about the stained glass at Loyola Chapel, but just being in that space and having no acknowledgement of any of the things that you've talked about today. So I guess that's a big question, and maybe it's a question for everybody here, but, you know, what do you think it'll take for people to start paying attention, maybe doing something about these names and these spaces and these symbols of colonialism that persist on our campus?
Thanks, Dr. Gossage. I would say, I mean, I think it has to do with knowledge. I think I speak as, you know, the university, as a member of the university, need to start teaching both ourselves, like self-educating, but also incorporating it into our curricula in various ways to teach our students about it. But then also, I guess, like, from my perspective, I mean, I guess we need to decide if we want to be leaders in this or not, because I think we're at a critical point where we risk being kind of left behind. I see McGill, I see Ryerson talking about this, kind of doing these projects. I have, you know, attended talks on these subjects at other schools, at Dalhousie as well, kind of recordings of lectures from previous years. Dalhousie released their report, I think on their 200th anniversary, which was, you know, 4 years ago. So that's kind of how I feel as a Concordian, as we kind of now risk, I think, being not leaders in this conversation. So I just think we need to decide, like, how do we want to take a proactive approach to this or not? And for people who say, like, okay, what are these connections? It seems a bit oblique, Colby. I don't see these connections as starkly as you do. I think it's because it certainly isn't obvious history. So I just think it's, yeah, an issue of self-education, like teaching ourselves about this, mostly. Thank you.
Wonderful. Again, any last minute questions? Now is the time, but thank you for everyone who has asked questions so far. They've been really wonderful. We'll leave a couple minutes if anyone wants to ask any last questions.
I'm just reading the comment someone left about having written a paper on Camp Gondwana and the YMCA. I'm very happy to hear that. I'm happy that other people have been researching this as well. I see they've left, but that's excellent. That's encouraging to see.
Wonderful. Well, I think it looks like we can start wrapping up. Again, thank you so much for your questions. I'll hand it over to Jordan for some last words.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you to Colby and for everyone who asked their questions. I think Colby's comment in response to Professor Gossich's question is actually a perfect way to end things, asking ourselves if we, our position within this ongoing discussion and whether we should, or how we should move forward is something that we should sort of leave with and linger with. I want to thank, as well as the people who asked the questions, everyone who joined us today and participated, and as well as the Department of Religions and Cultures for sponsoring this event. As I said before, we at AGIC are organizing several other events over the course of the semester that we'll be releasing sort of as they come. So you can check out our website for more on that. Other than that, thank you again to Colby for offering us such a wonderful lecture. Small little clap there, as best as we can. And Colby's email was submitted in the chat. And anyone who's interested in getting in touch with Colby can email AGIC and we can forward you however much information is needed. Otherwise, I think that is the end of our meeting. I bid you all a good afternoon and thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.